Today I'm going to talk a little bit about sovereignty, representative models for Indigenous people in Australia, and the models of representation currently in use by Indigenous people in the Sami Indigenous people rather of Northern Scandinavia. And I'm going to also talk a little bit about governance. So sovereignty, a loose definition of sovereignty is to have authority over a particular territory. There are different levels of sovereignty. There can be total sovereignty, where, for example, people have total authority. And there can be restricted sovereignty, where people may not necessarily have total authority, but may negotiate some form of authority. Terms such as sovereignty have been used in Indigenous struggles for land rights. However, the term has different meanings to different people. For example, Indigenous people may use the term to argue for full authority, whereas governments may take a different view. This different perspective was how the Aboriginal Tent Embassy in Canberra came about. The government at the time took the position that Aboriginal people could use their traditional lands if they could demonstrate to the government that they have a viable plan for things such as economic development. In this plan, they would also need to show that they could lease the land from the government. So once the government had assessed this plan and they were satisfied that it was going to work and that the group did have the finances to lease the land off the government, they would lease land to Indigenous people. Now, at the time, Aboriginal people thought, well, we want land rights, but we want our land to do what we want with. Now, three Aboriginal men in Canberra heard the news about this, and they pitched a tent on the lawns of Parliament House and said they would remain there until they got land rights. So again, that's how the Tent Embassy came about. Different perspectives on a term. Now, in the Madden reading, she refers to the term unfinished business, and this is a term that Indigenous people often use when they are campaigning for rights. The term implies that they have never actually surrendered their land to the colonisers. So take a couple of minutes after this recording to have a look at the Thorpe website on LearnLine. Now, what Indigenous people are saying in Australia is that there has never actually been any written document or agreement between Indigenous people and colonisers. In Australia, Indigenous people were denied any possibility of sovereignty on the grounds that they were subhuman, that they did not really exist or matter, that the land was terra nullius, and Indigenous people who were here were just nomads. And of course, as we know, the notion of terra nullius was only legally dismissed in Australia in the 1990s. So the governments of colonised countries around the world have been reluctant to address the issue of sovereignty and instead have preferred to talk about things such as health, education and employment. What people need to remember here is that these are government responsibilities anyway. So they should be delivering these services regardless. And I did of course say that governments have talked about these things. The fact that governments have failed in these areas is enough for Indigenous people to argue for at least some level of sovereignty. Another valid reason for Indigenous people wanting some level of sovereignty is that one of the United Nations Charter articles stipulates that all countries that are members of the United Nations should refrain from using force to challenge another country's territory or political independence. Now, according to the Cornell reading that we all should have done, tribal sovereignty is fundamental to Indigenous people successfully managing their own affairs. It is fundamental to the well-being of the economic future of Indigenous people. However, the issue of Indigenous sovereignty is not a straightforward one. There are many simple issues that need to be addressed, and really will probably not be able to be addressed. One of these significant issues is the issue of representation. Will all Indigenous people be subject to Indigenous law, for example? And which group's law? And who decides this? Do Indigenous people want to be told by other Indigenous people what laws they live under? For more information about Indigenous law and Western law, by the way, please make sure that you have a look at the Sutton reading and do the required activity. So, again, this is the issue with representation, is no models seem to work in Australia, and we're still trying to find one. Now let's have a look at a couple of models from Australia. ACIKE, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, which is no longer around, and the Sami Parliament model that exists among the Sami people, who of course, as we know, have had their traditional lands taken over by 4 different countries. So for example, if you get one of your fingers and slice it into 4 different parts, that's what's happened to the Sami traditional lands. Russia, Norway, Finland and Sweden have all colonised different parts of the Sami traditional lands. Now, I just spoke about sovereignty and explained what it is, and also explained that it is not a straightforward notion. As I said, one of the reasons for this is the issue of representation. So I want to spend a few minutes now talking a little bit about some attempts that have been made to overcome the issue of representation for Indigenous people. And as I said, we will look at Australia and we'll look at the Sami people. Now, I will begin by talking about Australia. In Australia, one attempt to provide Indigenous people with national representation was the former Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, or ACIKE as it was commonly known. ACIKE was created to provide Indigenous people with more participation in the formulation and implementation of government programs. This was done by a Western voting system where Indigenous people would nominate themselves for a particular constituency and people would turn up to vote on voting day. Indigenous people, of course. Now basically there were 35 regional council elections that were held every 4 years. Now these elected members would then elect a chair and a deputy chair. So these 35 regions, they would all have their own elections, and then the successful people who were voted in would vote for people to go off and be their chairs and deputy chairs, and then those chairs and deputy chairs would vote again for somebody from their board to be a regional or state territory ACIKE councillor, and then those people would nominate somebody from there to be the ACIKE commissioner and the ACIKE deputy commissioner. Okay, so that's how it worked. People get voted in, then they vote again for someone from there, then they vote again, then they vote again, and that's how you have the ACIKE commissioner at the time. So it is this individual and their deputy who supposedly represent all Indigenous Australians and can directly influence the agenda for governments and Indigenous people. So when we hear things such as treaty, self-determination, it was often those individuals who were able to push those messages and perpetuate the national Indigenous agenda. And those issues may not be important to other Indigenous people. Now, ACIKE was abolished in 1994 by the Howard government on the grounds that it had failed Indigenous people in terms of education, health and housing, for example. The Howard government's approach to ACIKE was helped by negative views towards ACIKE by Indigenous people. They would constantly see images of Indigenous people. This is these regional councillors and commissioners that I was referring to, in government jobs, flying around the country, going to conferences, meeting with government ministers. However, at the same time, Indigenous people were not seeing any positive outcomes in their communities. And on a daily basis, they were directly exposed to the images of a society entrenched in government neglect. Because of this, they became disenfranchised with ACIKE, and many wanted it to be gone. However, what many Indigenous people, and many non-Indigenous people for that matter, were not clear about was that ACIKE did not have any power. ACIKE was not responsible for service delivery of any kind. ACIKE was a Commonwealth government agency. Education, health and housing, for example, are state and territory government responsibilities. ACIKE also did not have a budget to deliver services. Most of its budget was spent on the Community Development Employment Project. For those of you who are not aware of the Community Development Employment Project, or CDEP as it is commonly referred to, it is a program that began in the 1970s where Indigenous people would perform tasks in their community such as rubbish removal, grounds maintenance and gardening duties, for example, and would be paid unemployment benefits as a wage. This is something that many people in non-Indigenous Australia are not aware of. We see this with the term sit-down money. I often wonder why Indigenous people are labelled with this term sit-down money and non-Indigenous people are not, particularly when Indigenous people have been working for unemployment benefits on CDEP since the 1970s. Since ACIKE was abolished in 1994, there has been one attempt made by the Australian government to provide a national voice for Indigenous people and to represent Indigenous people directly with the Australian government. This was the Howard government's appointed National Indigenous Advisory Council. This advisory council was, of course, criticised by Indigenous people on the grounds of representation. One of the things that governments have done with Indigenous issues is capitalise on this issue of representation. For example, governments may have an Indigenous Advisory Council on housing, for example, and often the members of that committee, Indigenous people, will be people who have no experience in housing or people who have no qualifications in the area. And therefore, you could have people who have low levels of English, who are illiterate, or these individuals have explained their political alliance or showed ideology which is similar to the government of the day. Often there are other plenty of other Indigenous people around who can contribute a lot more on these committees, but of course governments did not want people there who were going to rock the boat or question government and hold government to account. So what happens with these advisory councils often is governments will select people who are just going to go along with them or are not familiar with the issues. Because of this, these Indigenous advisory councils should be totally independent of government. It really does not matter what model of representation governments come up with. The government will still be in control of the Indigenous agenda. In Australia, Indigenous people are continuing to struggle to find a national voice for themselves. In other countries, however, such as the United States, which we will discuss or have discussed in week 4, Norway, Sweden and Finland. In these countries, Indigenous people have a national voice that talks directly to governments. The Sami have a parliamentary system that is similar to the ACIKE model. The Norwegian Sami Parliament was established in 1989 as a means for the Sami people in Norway to elect their own people to deal with their own issues. They also have elections every 4 years. Like ACIKE, the Sami Parliament receives its funding from the national government. The main purpose of the Norwegian Sami Parliament is to provide advice on Sami issues to the Norwegian government. In Finland, the Sami Parliament was opened in 1996. It consists of 21 representatives from the municipalities in the Sami domicile area. In Sweden, the Sami parliamentary system is similar. Russia is the only one of the 4 countries that colonized the traditional lands of the Sami that does not have a Sami parliament. However, at the moment, they are looking into the idea. Similarly to ACIKE in Australia, each Sami parliament elect a president. These presidents then have dialogue with the government of the day in each respective country, Norway, Sweden and Finland. So again, this is similar to the ACIKE model. These regional councillors are elected and they then select a chair and a co-chair. Those chairs and co-chairs get together and they select a national chairperson. And that chairperson has direct dialogue with the government. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about governance. I've just talked briefly about sovereignties and the issue involved with sovereignty through the discussion on ACIKE and the parliamentary systems of the Sami in Norway, Sweden and Finland. We have seen how issues such as sovereignty are placed on the national agenda. Now I want to spend a few minutes talking about governance. Some of you may be familiar with the term, some of you may not. Please note that the term governance is different to the term government. As I said last week, if Indigenous people want to be in control of their own affairs, they must practice good governance. This governance is a Western system of governance that is all too often completely foreign to Indigenous people. It is important to point out that there are no Indigenous organisations or corporations in Australia that exist independently of Western governance procedures. Good governance is crucial to Indigenous autonomy. In Australia, Indigenous organisations and corporations are typically not-for-profit organisations, and because of this, their governance models are typically like this. They have a list of members, they have their own rules about how these members become members and how these members elect a governing committee or a board of directors. This board of directors then hire and fire and manage the chief executive officer of the organisation. The chief executive officer manages the organisation